Welcome back. So, you probably saw a new color, and you know what a new color means, usually. It means we're covering a new program language. Well, what language are we covering? Well, for those of us who have ever used Power BI or Power Query, we are going to be covering the program language that drives both of those applications. More specifically, we are going to be covering the M formula language. So this was basically it was a language developed by Microsoft that is used pretty much within Power Query, Excel, Power BI, and then what else is it? Analysis services as well too. So there's a couple different things that we're going to have to do in order to kind of get ourselves situated to where we can effectively code with this particular language. And then more importantly, what are we covering in this video? Well, you can kind of think of this as the introduction video. So we're going to give you kind of like a high level overview as to what the language is, and just doing typical things like you would do in any type of program language. So declaring data types, understanding what the data types are, understanding the syntax behind the particular language. And then we'll do a couple different things related to operators and understanding how that works, type conversion, and things along that nature. And then also, I'm going to get you set up so that way you can have syntax highlighting. So this was always a big problem for a long time. You could write your own queries, but for the love of God, it was a pain because there was no syntax highlighting and there was no IntelliSense. Luckily, if you are on pretty much, I would say, the most recent version of Excel, and if you're staying pretty consistently updated, you should have access to the new tools that provide syntax highlighting and also IntelliSense. So, with that being said, let's introduce the M formula language. So, a lot of the things that you're seeing on this particular file right now, this is all coming from the Microsoft documentation. I decided why reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. They had a lot of good examples, and really all we're going to do is just kind of go over them and then probably talk about them in a little bit more detail. So, the first thing, what is the M formula language? Well, Microsoft Power Query provides a powerful data import experience that encompasses many features. Power Query works with analysis services, Excel, and Power BI workbooks. A core capability of Power Query is to filter and combine, that is, to mash up data from one or more of a rich collection of supported data sources. Any such data mashup is expressed using the Power Query M formula language. It is a functional case sensitive language similar to F sharp. So, a couple key important things there. Pretty much anyone who's ever been inside of Excel and they have ever gone underneath the data tab and went over here to the get and transform data group, any of these little functions right here, any of these little buttons, if you've ever clicked them, if you've ever clicked this drop down and said, hey, I want to import from a workbook, from a database, an online service, whatever it might be, all of these little buttons behind the scenes is leveraging Power Query. And Power Query leverages an engine called the mashup engine. And what that does is it is basically taking that data and it can aggregate it from a lot of different sources. So most of the time, at least for me, I'm usually just working with one data source. But technically with Power Query, you can take data from SQL. You could take it from the web. You could take it from an Excel table. You can take it from all these different sources and mash it up into a single data source. So it's a really powerful tool. It's very popular. And you'll actually find a lot of Excel tutorials online on just how to use all the functionality behind Power Query. In fact, just to kind of give you an idea of what it would look like, I'm just going to do a really simple example. And then we'll put 99 because I'm 99 years old. No, I'm not, but regardless. All right, so I have an Excel table, typical list object. If I was to do from the table or range what is it? Object, then basically it imports it into Power Query for me, and you'll see all this wonderful stuff. You're like, oh, okay, bunch of fun, interesting stuff, right? You could always understand, where's this data coming from. You can always, look at your recent sources if you have any. But normally, you do your transformation, whatever it might be, and then you say, hey, close and load to. You had all these options. You could do table, pivot chart, or you had this really cool one, which was like only create a connection, which I thought was really cool. You basically can have it behind the scenes, but it doesn't actually load in the workbook. And for the most part, people kind of left it there. You could actually see your existing connections and say, for example, here, this will tell me all the connections I have currently within Excel and on my network and computer and stuff like that. But if you ever right click this and you said, hey, edit connection properties, you get all this bunch of stuff and you're like, whatever, no one cares. Really, what you would kind of look down here is first, you knew this connection type was an OLEDB query. But the kind of cooler part is if you look here, you can see the connection string. And you'll see this Microsoft.mashup.oledb.1. That is Microsoft's mashup engine. That is really the engine itself that is taking that data and transforming it, mashing it, whatever you want to say. That is the engine. And the M language is used to basically get the functionality of that engine, and you can use it in your particular Excel application. So again, if you've ever used Power Query, you might not necessarily know what was going on behind the scenes, but really all it was doing is it was leveraging this built-in engine that was mashing up all these data sources, and that engine can be manipulated through the M language reference. That's really all you kind of need to know at this point. So from here, I'm just going to delete that. Yeah, you can delete it. Nobody cares. And I'm going to delete this stuff too. So you could access Power Query through Excel. That's probably one that most people use pretty heavily. The other place you could leverage Power Query was from within Power BI Desktop. So Power BI Desktop is basically a tool we use for dashboarding. So creating dashboards, data visualization tools that we can use to kind of summarize our data. And inside Power BI, you really kind of had these two main features. You had this tool that was very similar to Power Pivot, which allowed you to build basically data models. And then you also had the get data and transform tool, which was Power Query. So inside Power BI, if you ever had to get data, just like you did in Excel, you were again leveraging the Power Query interface, so the application, which is then using the same engine. And so really there were just kind of two different places you were using it at this point. I'm not really sure if it's used anything beyond that. I know they've used it with like analysis services. I don't know in what fashion it's used inside of analysis services, but it wouldn't surprise me if it is used because this is a really popular tool and it's really cool that you can just do all these kind of different things really easily. So that's kind of where you could use Power Query. Um, you know, Beyond that, what kind of program language is Power Query? Well, at this point, it's a functional program language. And really, all that means at the end of the day is it's going to be, it takes a little bit kind of to get used to, but honestly, I think it's a relatively easy kind of language to pick up because I think it's more intuitive. It just kind of makes more sense. At least from my experience, I found it wasn't that hard to pick up the language. So, I would say probably it's been one of the easier ones for me, that and SQL for the most part. So, with a functional programming language, really all you're doing is each variable you define. So, like right down here, I have a variable. This variable equals an expression. And really, this expression is simply a function that takes an input and then returns the output and stores it in this variable, whatever it might be. And so, really, what you're trying to do with a functional programming language is you're trying to take your problem and solve it with just functions. So, there's kind of some key things to understand about a functional program language. So, first of all, one thing is that the data is immutable, so you can't actually change it. but you can take the results of one function and pass it through to another function. So what that kind of means is if I have two variables that I define here, so maybe I'll just call this source2, right? And all I do is you know I take text whatever the result of this one is, and I say, okay, I want to take that one, and then I want to maybe like join it with something. I don't even know if that's really a function, to be honest, but I could check really quick. This is what we're going to go through next. But there's like all these different functions you can do, right? So maybe I want to insert something into my text, right? So I can insert C between B and D. So maybe I want to insert something inside my my string hello world, right? So I would pass through as my argument my source, so the result of my first function, and then in this particular function, at least for the insert function, it does require a couple more arguments. The first argument is the position that you want to insert after. So in this case, I want to insert after the second character. So if I say, okay, hey, after the second character, I want to insert the letter A, for example. So really all you're doing is you're taking the result of one function, you're passing it through to another function, and that result from that function is going to be stored in another variable. So everything is being used, everything basically is being done with functions. And really what you try to do is you try to define the problem that you're trying to solve in the form of functions. And more importantly, it's kind of assumed that you almost in a sense know how to solve your problem because you have to be able to define the functions that you would be using in order to solve that particular problem. So maybe my problem is I need to aggregate all the numbers in a list. I just need to define a function that will simply take all those items and store it in a single aggregated value. And then I can display the result of that to the user. In fact, if you really want to think about it too, Excel is kind of like a functional language, right? So for example, I could have cell B2 equal to 2 and then B3 equal to 3. And I have a formula that will simply add the content of those two cells. This, in a sense, is a pure function, right? So this, the formula, the function doesn't change. It takes whatever the content of B2 plus B3 is, right? And so you can change the inputs, but the function as a whole does not change. So that's just kind of high level how you need to think about it for the mashup language, or just basically the M language. Everything is in terms of functions. So you pass through the arguments to a function, you store the results of those functions to a variable, and then you can take that and store it and pass along into another function. And that kind of leads us to our next kind of topic a little bit, which is, what is an M formula language query, right? So we understand that the M formula language is this language that we use to really manipulate and transform data. But how do we write a script in a sense that will do multiple transformations at once? Well, we basically define a query, and a query is simply composed of formula expression steps that create a mashup query. And really, that's kind of just defined in the first sentence. So a Power Query M formula language query is composed of formula expressions. So basically these little guys right here. And it's a set of them, and they're organized in steps that create this mashup query. A formula expression can be computed, yielding a value. The let expression encapsulates a set of values to be computed, assigned names, and then used in a subsequent expression that follows the in statement. So what that means, and this you'll probably will see it very, very heavily, one of the two key words in the Power Query M language is let and n. So let is where we define the variables that contain our expressions, and we can think of each variable as being a step in that mashup process. So maybe step 1 is load the data. Step 2 is remove duplicates. Step 3 is group the data, and so on and so on. So normally you'll see a query language that has multiple steps where each step is really doing some type of transformation to the data. And then finally, when you're done defining all your different steps, you say, hey, I want the output to be one of the steps that I'm currently at. And we define the output by in and then whatever variable we have after the in keyword. So whatever comes after in is shown in the user interface for Power Query and Power BI desktop. So again, just a reminder, let encapsulates multiple steps usually inside a mashup query where each step usually is doing some type of transformation. And then the final transformation or the final step that I want to be shown to the user, we have that below the in keyword. Now, technically, you can define all your steps. There's no reason the last step has to be the one that you show. It is totally okay to have maybe the second to last step be it. You could have the first one be the output one. You could have the third one. There's no rule that says you have to have the last step be the one that you display to the user. Now, normally, that's usually what you want, but sometimes there are cases where that is not the case. So at this point, hopefully you now have a better understanding about what the M formula language is. You have a better understanding about how a query is structured. And what we're going to do next is I'm going to show you how to get syntax highlighting on your system if you currently do not have it. So for those of you who, for whatever reason, maybe you don't have access to Power BI, maybe you are running on an older version of Excel, you probably will not have syntax highlighting in Power Query. And that makes it really, really hard to code. Really hard to code. That's why I hated trying to ever do it. In fact, that's probably one of the reasons why I struggled in the beginning to learn this language was because there really wasn't any help internally within the Excel application. And it wasn't really until I came across the Microsoft documentation that I was actually starting to get relatively comfortable with it. So there's a little trick. If you are on Visual Studios or if you have Visual Studio Code, I would recommend Visual Studio Code. That's usually my first one. There is an extension that you can install. So currently I have my Visual Studio Code application opened and I have my Power Query script in here. And as you can tell, it's all the same color. So that means there's no syntax highlighting. So if you go over here to the left side and you click this little kind of like building block icon, I guess, it will highlight extensions. You can actually add an extension for the Power Query M language. And I think there's multiple, I can't remember to be honest. Basically, the first one that comes up, you can install that. So if you just click the install button, it does it pretty quickly. I mean, it's actually technically done now. And if you want, there's some links here. I really haven't read too much into it. I kind of just got it. Once you're here, it actually, in this point, it identified it. And now you'll start seeing the syntax highlighting. And so from here, this will give you syntax highlighting. It's supposed to, I don't, see, that's the thing. I'm not entirely sure if it actually truly gives you, what is it, IntelliSense. I haven't tried it on my personal computer yet, but I think for IntelliSense, it's Control Spacebar. Yeah, that's what I thought. I'll try it out, but it doesn't really provide IntelliSense. It's really more of the syntax highlighting that it offers you. So unfortunately, that's kind of all you get at this point. But as you move to newer versions of Excel, they will have syntax highlighting and IntelliSense built in to the Power Query application and Power BI desktop. So that will make coding 10 times easier, trust me. The other thing I do want to share with everyone is There is documentation on the Power Query M formula language. I do encourage you to read through it if you get a chance. It's kind of interesting, and you can download most of this documentation to a PDF file, so it's right here. Uh, Basically, if anything, you should go through the type system, language system, this one, expression values, and let expression, comments, evaluation model, operators, all that kind of fun stuff. More than likely, at a certain point, this is what you're going to be dealing with heavily. These are really all the category of functions that you can use. So some are related to date, some are related to function values, some are related to list, logical functions, text, accessing data functions. Those will be fun. Those are really fun. But there's a lot of cool stuff here. And, you might be asking yourself, why do I even need to learn the M language? Like, Power Query is pretty good as it is, right? You can do a lot in Power Query, and they're always adding functionality. There are going to be certain times inside of Power Query where the type of query that you are trying to do is very, very complex. And if you know how to manipulate the M language behind it, usually you can dramatically reduce the complexity and the number of steps inside your actual query. And you'll also find that certain functionality is not necessarily built into the user interface. It might seem like it is, but it's not necessarily. And it's a lot easier to do what you need to do by just simply writing the code yourself than trying to do it with 9 different steps in the actual user interface. That's usually what kind of motivates people to learn the M language, is they'll find like, oh, you mean I don't have to do 20 different steps in the user interface? I can just write 2 lines of code and I'm pretty much good to go. Yeah, that's usually what it is. So that's really the reason behind why you should learn this language. A lot of it does have to do with making your actual queries a lot more manageable and easier, and giving you more flexibility as to how you want to actually transform and handle the data. So let me check how much time I'm at right now. I don't want to go too far. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to cut the video here. I think that's enough for kind of our introduction. In our next video, we're going to start covering data types. We're going to start covering operators, and we're going to cover type transformations. So again, not the most exciting topic, but it is important that you understand how those kind of tools work behind the scenes, because if you don't, it's going to make a lot of things a lot harder than it has to be. So if you have any questions at this point, feel free to put them down in the comments below. Also, if you could, please make sure to like the video. We always appreciate the support. And if you're not already, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates as we release new videos on more fun topics. So thank you again for watching, everybody. We'll see you in the next video.